Okay, so we covered a lot in the last lesson. I'm really excited for this one. We're going to continue through. We're on video 6, so we've only got a few lessons left. I've gotten a lot of email about the VFX bootcamp, so I don't want to sound too preachy, but I had 3 key questions that kept coming up over and over and over in my inbox. So I just want to take a second to cover these. One of the key things was what kind of hardware requirements would you need for the course. So all I'd suggest is a regular gaming PC. As long as you have 16 gigs of RAM, you're going to be fine. So like if you're doing this class, then obviously you're able to do that sort of effects work. So if you're able to handle the lessons as you're going through the City Destruction training, then that's all you need to be able to go through the course as well. If anything, in those lessons we actually learn to optimize things a lot more and make things a lot faster. So the other thing was how much time to spend in the course, so how much time or free time should I have. So some people go through these lessons really quick and others take their time to go through it and maybe even do it a couple of times to make it really resonate. So the cool thing is that you do have lifetime access to these lessons. So although that you can only sign up for the boot camp in the next couple of days, once you have it, you'll have access to it forever. And a lot of us are working or have family commitments and other things like that, so I suggest trying to spend a couple of hours each week doing the training. It's not hard to do that. One of my students is a CG supervisor at one of the major studios in Hollywood, and even just recently he was working on some pretty major films, and he also had a big drive from Pasadena to LA every day in LA traffic. So he simply just got up an hour early every day, and it meant that he had an extra hour each day of the week to go through the class. And you don't even need to do that, but it's just something that I suggest is like make time to make growth in your career, to make growth in your skills. It's as simple as that. What you put in is what you get out. So like I said, as long as you sign up this week, you'll have lifetime access to the course material. So just take your time. It's not a race. So I just wanted to make it 4 weeks. So for those who want to be really aggressive going through the training, they can get those results fast. Lastly, in terms of software, we're using the exact same tools that you're using here. So whether you're using TP and FumeFX, or if you want to use other software packages, whatever you're doing this training in, it's exactly the same tools. So even if you're using another software package and you're able to follow along with the City Destruction, then that means you'll be able to do the same for the bootcamp as well. It's more about the process. The tools are all the same in the end. Now, like I said, I didn't want to put a lot of focus on that, but I did want to at least just cover those questions really quickly because those ones are coming up quite a lot. So I want to get right into this video. Like I said, I'm going to be flying out to Canada and I want to get this lesson out right away. But hopefully this is something that you're ready to commit to and really kind of take the next step in your training. But otherwise, we still have 2 more lessons after this one. So there's still a bit of time to go through the training and make the most of it while it's available. Anyway, let's get into this video. Okay, so I apologize, but I will be going through this lesson rather quickly, and obviously we have a lot to go through, so I'm going to dive right into this, but basically what we're going to be looking at now is getting the basic integration going for our shot. I won't be pushing it all the way through to like a final shot necessarily, but we will go through quite a lot. So we have all of our layers, and the good thing is we have all of our render layers all here, which is cool because it means that we don't need to dig through lots and lots of stuff to get to what we need. So thinking 001 is what we've called this so far. We could also rename this to thinking building 1, something like that if we wanted as well. I'm not going to worry about naming conventions, things like that moving forward. Unfortunately, just given the timing of the year, I've got to be literally the other side of Canada in a few hours, so I'm going to keep pushing through with this, but with the elements here, like basically we've cached everything out, so we're in a pretty good spot. I'm just going to turn off secondaries, everything else. We have everything here, and I created this operator. I'm not sure whether I talked about it. I'm pretty sure I did, but this would be a way for us to create all of our shaders and everything rather than having to do it early on. We can actually do it afterwards. Now, I will just say one thing, that typically what I'm doing is backwards, okay? I wouldn't be doing the rendering and lighting, or at least the asset setup, so late in the game. Usually what would happen is the lighting department would work on or a scene assembly would work on building out the shot, and then effects would jump in, start doing all that. Usually effects and lighting will end up working hand in hand towards the end, but it's usually effects and comp are the two that work together the most. So doing all the effects and dynamics and then doing the shader setup and everything else is a little bit counterintuitive. Usually we've locked textures and shaders earlier on most of the time. But obviously I want to talk about effects, and if I was to do lesson 1 as a shader course, it would just kind of probably communicate the wrong idea. So that being said, let's see. I'm going to turn this on. And one little trick, TP is a bit weird about materials. Yeah, I won't get into it. It's just, it is what it is. So I've got TP selected. One thing is a little bit of scripting I'm going to do is $.material equals undefined. I'm doing that just because I'm stripping away all the materials. I spent a bit of time once just saying, okay, I'm going to really figure out the best ways to fight TP and some of the ways it handles shaders. So all I've done is I just removed all the materials from it in terms of what was assigned. So it'll eventually build its own nested shader tree that's different to what we're dealing with. But for now, let's just set up the most basic layer, okay? If we wanted to, we'll keep this all on. I'm just going to go into B1, so collision B1. I'm going to simply put down a shape material, and let's link these together. And let's go into the material editor, okay? So you should know how to bring that up. I hope that button there. I'm going to be hotkey centric right now, so just FYI. Okay. Now, early on, we created this thing which was material ID 1, 2, 3. So 2 was the camera projection. All right, just keep that in mind. What we're going to do first is we're going to bring in the HDRI, okay, and we're going to use the HDRI to create all the lighting based on the image intensity. So HDRI is high dynamic range image, or HDR is what you would more commonly hear in terms of now HDR TVs and YouTube's HDR. Everything is going HDR, which means it's got a much larger range than 16-bit images would, or let's say an 8-bit image would only have a certain clamped range. Well, here we can actually go 16-bit, or we can go 32-bit if you really want to push it. In this case, it just means that you're able to capture all of the lighting information from a set. You're going to survey it, and from there you're able to utilize that image information to relight or recreate the lighting from that environment. So I want to put out some training on this soon. We're going to be diving into it pretty in depth in the live action series, but I also want to do some free training on it as well. Basically just how to, like, all the different gear you can use, how to do it, what's involved, the process, and yeah, basically the tools that I use. Because you could use like a Nodal Ninja, you could use something like that. You could use like different pano heads. There's lots of different things that you can work with, and I've got them all, and I've experimented a lot. So in this case, I'm just going to quickly pull in the HDR that I created. So I'm just going to go to a new slot here, hit get material, and let's just type in V-Ray HDRI. Should be under maps. Okay, so you can load in a general bitmap if you wanted to, but the V-Ray HDRI just has a lot more controls. So at least for me, I'm just using my HDRI here. Now, I will admit, I initially built this HDRI very quickly, and it was just initially at the beginning of this, I meant to go back and make a nice one, because this one I did a terrible job on. Just again, time has been a huge factor this month, especially I mentioned buying a house and all these other things. So it's been a whirlwind of stuff. So the HDR that I have is good. It's just you know, it isn't clean. So I mean, I always think that there's stuff that I would do for my studio with CG that, you know, I'm happy with, but then if I was to be hired as a VFX soup for a client, then it would be a whole other thing. So for instance, I love shooting with the Ricoh Theta S. It's a small, it's actually on my desk right now. It's a small 360 camera, very light, very simple, and it means you can go out quickly and survey a set without needing to disrupt production while they're shooting, things like that. But at the same time, the way that it shoots is it's bracketing JPEGs rather than shooting raw DNGs or anything like that to then be able to put together. So you need more brackets. It is a JPEG, so it does have some slight artifacting. Things like that, it does the job, but at the same time, I'm always going to do the highest quality and the set level of expectations when it comes to a client. But if it's something that I know what we need and we don't need it to be 100% accurate, it's not as much for reflections, this is for lighting, then I'm kind of happy to change that up a little bit. So that's the general gist of like how I'll work. It just really depends on what our needs are. So in this case, the HDR is fine. It's just I did some really terrible rubber stamping to remove the tripod. That's what I mean. Like besides that, it's perfectly fine. So this is our HDR, and basically, you know, we can blow it out, or we can bring it, really low light as well. So we have a lot of information in there to work with. So I haven't done any grading to this at all. It's just as is, and that's totally fine. Basically, all I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to be spherical, and I'm just going to go to my top viewport, go to lighting, V-Ray light, and I'm just going to change this. Whoops, don't click that. I'm going to change this to a dome, and then drag this out in the viewport. So all we're doing is we're just dumping a light in. I'm going to go to the modify panel because we don't have any lights yet, and we have this texture we can throw in. So I'm going to say use texture, and it's going to drag our HDR in as an instance. Let's also set the res to at least 1024, you know, just to get as much information as we can in there. Everything else I'm pretty much going to leave the same for now. Let's see. Yeah, I'll leave this all the same for now. What we'll do is let's go to the rendering menu here. And I'm just going to get this set up right now for GI. I'm also just going to bounce back to frame 70. All right. Okay, so this is our render menu. I'm just going to go to GI, enable GI, brute force light cache. That's fine. We will up the samples later. For now, that's all cool. 12 buckets. So, you know, like I said, I'm going to go through this quick. Subdivs and subdivs here and here, essentially sampling. So our bucket is just how smaller a bucket it's going to render. Just mean it's quicker for what we're doing. I want to keep this on adaptive. I want to keep motion blur off. It's not really going to matter too much, but I just want to render stuff fast. Settings, I might set my dynamic range to 24 gig. Yeah, I'm not really going to do much there. I basically just turned on GI, okay? So GI and using our V-Ray light here, let's just render out a frame and we can see how this looks. Keep in mind that anything and everything in the scene, whatever colors are currently set up, it's going to be splashing that around quite a lot. So there's a bit of blue, things like that in there. Let's go back into TP. And just under this material override, I think I was doing this before, but I just want to get a regular V-Ray material. So let's just click get material in this slot. We'll say V-Ray. I just want to get a regular V-Ray material. And I'm just going to call this plastic shader. I'm going to actually also, let's do this. Go options. And let's show more material slots. I'm going to drag this guy over here. And once it's copied, I'm going to call this matte. And let's make the color black. So I might do some stuff later. I just want to have both those handy. For now, let's just go to shape material, get this V-Ray plastic shader, and let's just drag that into the slot here as an instance. And at least now everything's going to render gray. So there's still blues coming up, and that's mainly reflection from the sky. Okay, so the sky obviously is blue, and that's projecting a lot of blue down onto the scene. Now, just because this is our environment here, you might look at our plate, it's pretty washed out. Obviously, we can do some grading to this. We could also do tone mapping. I personally find tone mapping to be a bit of a wank. Okay, like tone mapping is cool when you're messing with HDRs, but tone mapping in HDRI kind of defeats the purpose. Okay, because I've seen people do it, and I'm like, why are you doing that? Tone mapping, unless there's specific things like you didn't bracket properly and you want to pull more, or you want to crunch down the exposures and get a bit more information where you can. Tone mapping is one of those things that, like, your plate isn't tone mapped, and usually you want them to be consistent. I do think the colors here are a bit more vibrant than my JPEG plate that we're using. That's just, it's not log, but it's essentially red log. So with this, you know, right now it is a lot more vibrant than the rest of the colors, but I can simply put a color correct on this. Color correction, keep old map. If I wanted just to saturate a little bit, because we can grade stuff later, but I wouldn't mind killing some of that blue. I can also push this color space just a little bit, just a tiny bit. Main thing is like brightness and contrast. If you want, we can play with that. I can pull the contrast down, and that's just going to wash things out a little bit. So, you know, there's a bit we can play with here. I'm not too fussed about it really, because as long as the luminance values are pretty in sync in terms of the histogram, then that's cool with me, because we can always grade it to be whatever colors we want later in comp. So I don't mind pushing it a little bit. The main thing is that right now this is gray. We've got the sky here. Oh yeah, so if we look at our render, it might have shown up that the bridge, I think we need to rotate the HDR a little bit. So let's just go into our map. And actually, maybe I didn't do the best job. I might have rushed things a little bit more than I thought. All right, so that's fine. I'm just gonna flip this. I feel that's a bit more close to what we're doing. All right, so something like that will do. I might just bring it back. Yeah, so I think that's fine. It's going to keep this at 0, but it's going to flip it. Everything else is fine. So at this point, like, I usually keep the light visible just while I match up the HDR or HDRI, and I go to options and just say invisible, and that way it's not going to show up. Now the next thing that we need to do is we need to set up the plates. So go into the rendering menu, environment. I'm just going to bring this up. We should be very familiar with it by now. I'm just going to say get bitmap. Pull in the bitmap. I don't think we need to offset the time, or maybe we do by 1. I can't remember. I think we don't have to. No, we don't have to. Alright, so what I'm going to do, I'm simply going to say environment. And in here, I'm just going to drop this map in as the background. Okay, at least that way we can kind of see them hand in hand and see what we got to do. So this is a good starting point. Now, the position of this doesn't really matter. What I want to do is I need to kind of match the lighting levels a little bit. A couple things. First of all, the our TP right now, like we set up shaders and all this other stuff for this, so let's start to use these. Going to the material editor, we have this multi-map, and I'm just going to drag that in there, and it's going to assign it. So I might need to refresh this, but that multi-map's going to show up. Now we can see red, and also, depending on what angle, you'll actually see that red splash everywhere. Now that red, I'm going to drag this V-Ray material as a copy. Now let's just call this projection shader, and then I'm going to drag this shader in as a copy, make sure it's a copy, and then change it back to texture. And I did that kind of quickly before. Make sure this is an environment, but this guy is a texture. And that way it's going to be a texture map, and it's going to use the mapping that was baked on here to work with it. However, we can set this stuff up. So, again, going through is quick, but all I'm doing is getting that multi-map and replacing the red shader with an actual texture map of the environment. I'm going to go to cameras, and let's just simply go, sorry, it's late at night here. What I'm doing, camera map, and there's also, I think, material time. Alright, so let's link these guys all up, and camera map, I can click here and choose my camera, and now it's going to do a projection based on that camera. And then material time, I think operator time, it's been a while, and we got that. So let's do another render of this now, and we should have the texture map applied, projected, and the correct timing. Awesome. Okay, so that worked. Now we've got that set up so TP is actually projecting that map over the geometry. Now it is a bit darker, and that's up to us if we wanted to either screw with the lighting. And by the way, I haven't actually put that in the correct spot, so let's just drag this into lights. Now we set this to be like 20. Let's try that. Okay, that's a little intense. Usually, here's like my quick way of just getting this matched really quick. I'm just going to create a sphere, move it over the environment. Might make this like 15. Gonna hold shift and duplicate again. Alright, so that plastic shader I'm going to put on this guy, and then the black shader I'm going to put on this guy, and then this guy I'm going to right click, V-Ray properties, matte negative alpha, and then that's just going to make it a matte object. I'm going through this quick, but I put out other material on this stuff. Hopefully you've seen it. This is stuff that we go through thoroughly in the live action series, but I'm just having to rush this stuff out today. So with the plastic shader, let's see. Yeah, I won't really worry about, I might make this ward. Yeah, I won't really worry about doing much with this for now. Basically, this one here is a matte object, so it's actually going to occlude all the CG, and it's going to show or protect the background. And the other one's just a plastic gray. So the reason I'm doing that is because it's going to be a lot easier to kind of see like what my light levels are. And this one here is actually projecting, or sorry, protecting the background. So it's just a really quick way for me to be able to match this side by side with the CG, you know, in CG. Sorry, with the live action, going nuts today, to match it to the plate a lot easier. And I'm not trying to match 100% to the background. Okay, like first of all, this is an ungraded plate, and on top of that, I can bump the grade a little bit where I need to in comp, but I just want to get the lighting levels, more importantly, to where I need it to be. The other thing is my samples and everything are so low, so there's a lot of noise, so I always got to disregard that as well. So that's one thing. I'm also going to go into my HDR because I do feel like it's way more contrasty in my HDR. So I'm gonna drop my contrast down more. And I'm also going to drop my saturation down a little bit. Finally, the brightness. All right, at least that way it's not as washed out. Sorry, not, yeah, the colors aren't as vibrant. There's not as much contrast in there. All right. And I guarantee that just because this area matches doesn't mean there aren't going to be other areas that are much darker. And that's kind of the game we got to play here. So I feel like that's getting better. Finally, I'm going to go into my HDR. I'm just going to neutralize this a bit more. So go output, enable this, and I'm just going to get my darks and brights. I'm going to push the darks a little bit and more crunch the brights a little bit. And that way, like if there is any areas that are really dark, hopefully this is going to push that up a bit. Let me just do this. All right. Now, on top of that, I'm going to go to my shader. I'm just going to bump up my subdivs to 24 here. I'm going to be sloppy. We can optimize our renders later. I'm not worried about that stuff right now. Just go to my rendering menu. And we got GI. I'm going to put this to about 16 and put this to 6. So I'm just putting in a bit more samples so we're going to get less noise, so these two are a bit more comparative. All right. Finally, going back in here, I will bump my saturation back up a little and the contrast because it's a little too washed out. All right, so that'll do. Okay, now, at this point, let's move the camera over a little bit more so we can see more of this. The other thing is we haven't set up the other shaders yet. So right now, the front faces here, that's all projection. And over here is going to look messy because it's projecting, but we actually have another house in the way of that. So also they're changing groups right now. We haven't set that up either. So suddenly we've got these red areas, and this is also going to affect the color. Having all these bright colors is going to affect the lighting in the shot because they're extremely bright, so it's actually going to contaminate the scene a fair bit. Let's set that up as well. So we've got this all set up. For now, I'm just going to go SC. I'll do dumb as well. Okay, so now all those shaders are set up. The thing is, we haven't actually set up shaders for everything else yet. So I'm just going to left click, drag and copy the shader here, but I'm also going to drag and copy that as an instance to here. So let me just quickly do this. I'm just going to call this concrete texture. And it's basically, I mean, I will admit, like usually I would do it per building, and I might still do that, but these concrete textures are going to be everything that isn't the projection, basically, for now. So let's go into them. I'm just going to right click and cut that texture out of there, the plate, and let's just add in a new bitmap. And I just pulled something off the web. It really doesn't matter too much. You know, again, I apologize why I am going to half-ass this a little bit. where usually what I would do is I would go in, and this is something I actually was hoping I would find time to do, but I won't be able to this time around. But I want to get into using Substance to create all the custom maps, so we can try and create a painted photoreal baked building that really matches accurately, which is a lot of what we're doing in the live action series, and kind of going over like Substance whole workflow and how to get stuff in there, bake out all the curvature maps, all the AO, everything that we need to create all the wear and tear and make realistic textures. Unfortunately for now, I'm just going to be throwing this on instead. So this will do. I'm going to do a color correction, so color keep, and I'm just going to desaturate this a bit. Alright, so other than that, I'm just going to drag this into roughness as an instance. Reflection, I'm just going to turn off for now, do a fall off. For now, and I don't imagine these to be very reflective, so I'm just going to make it more washed out. Okay. So same deal, I'm just going to copy that map, and I might as well just quickly do this for the projection. The projection, again, all I care about with the projection is more about getting more light in the darker areas. So with this, I'm going to punch it up a bit. Actually, some of that should be fine. Okay. I'm just going to render out a frame now. It's going to look a lot different. We won't have those blues, those reds, those greens. They'll be a lot more consistent. But again, we're just going to marching through pretty quick. All right. So I'll take that back. Let me jump back into TP. This is what I mean about TP, where I'm just doing it here. This is the script listener. I'm just going to say $thinking star dot material equals undefined. I'm just blasting that shader because I do find that if you're updating your shaders, sometimes it requires you to reassign these. It's the one thing that, you know, like I said, if you've already built all your shaders ahead of time, then you can bake this all in. You don't need to worry about it. But if you're doing all the lighting on the other end, like tweaking it all, that's one disadvantage of doing it all in TP. What I would actually recommend is outputting everything as an Alembic cache, and then just working with real geometry like you would. And lighters prefer that too, if you could just give them geometry rather than it being, you know, like a TP file or something. So anyway, that's looking fine. Now let's just kind of make this a bit darker. I don't want it to be that bright. And what we could do actually is, I'm trying to remember the IDs. I think 3 is the sides. Yeah, it is. So let's make this unique. So this way this one can be brighter. But that's because we instanced them and just breaking the chain. But then the top one here, let's make this a lot darker to kind of more match the plate. And like I said, this is where this one here would be the one that I would custom make the shader, the textures, everything for it. Rather than just slapping a texture on. The sides that get cut are what I'd slap a texture on. So I'm going to bring my brightness down. Let's just try that. So that's a bit better. I'm going to up the saturation a little bit. I wouldn't mind just seeing what kind of colors get introduced. Bring the brightness down just a little bit more. I'll do this one last time. Okay, so I feel like that's pretty fine. Obviously, when we get to doing individual shaders, if we do, then that's where I'll kind of like get a bit more specific and maybe kind of push these two to kind of look the same. But we will also set up mats when we're rendering all this out, so we can grade this to match the plate a lot more. Plus we can grade the plate and the CG to kind of match more accurately. Again, I'm not too concerned about that. I do think, you know, both combination of the lighting, I can put this up to like a little bit higher there, as well as just playing with the shader itself to kind of match, I think that we get it pretty close. Go back in one last time. Might it's mainly in here, which I was trying to avoid. I was kind of happy to kind of neutralize it, but that's what's going to push it a lot more closer. All right, so at this point though, you know, I just want to kind of get the basics of this going. We don't have the pipe. We didn't do that. Again, there's just so many things that I want to do in here, but we're not going to get around to, unfortunately. So that's fine. All right. So what I want to do here is I just want to kind of get the basic shader going where we can go and modify it more later. And, you know, that's not too big a deal. We've got that working. We've got this all going. Let's look at the atmospherics really quick. So right now we have lighting set up for our HDR, like for our environment, but we haven't actually done it for Fume. And technically you want to do it differently. You want to do custom lighting for that. These basically, I think now you might be able to use HDR. Like at least last time I checked about a year ago you couldn't, but I have a feeling you can now for Fume effects if you wanted just to plug an HDR in. Before you couldn't, which meant that you need to kind of mimic it a little bit. And the big disconnect is when lighting artists go and light effects thinking you would do it the same way. And usually the geometry, the systems are way more complex for effects. So going and putting in 100 lights to try and get the rim and everything like perfect sometimes isn't the right way. You got to be a bit more conservative with your lighting. Usually I'll use like 2 or 3 lights, that's about it. These days you also have the V-Ray volume grid, which is kind of cool because you can bring in F3D, VBD, FXD, you know, so you can bring in like Houdini sims, you can bring in Maya sims, you can bring Max sims, you can bring whatever you want and be able to render it out in here. And like ILM, for instance, does a lot of that, where you'll create VDBs, which is a open file format for doing volumetrics that you might make them in Houdini, but bring it into 3ds Max to render it out for a lot of productions. Like that sort of workflow works really well, depending on what you're doing. So, you know, depending on what you want to do, you can do that. I'm just going to stick with straight up Fume for this. And let's just look at the dust initially. So we got the dust here. All right, actually, yes, I want to create a light. So with the light active here, I'm just going to create a regular light. I'm just going to start with 1. I'm going to drop this in, and I'm just positioning this up in the air a little bit, maybe over to the side. Now, here's the important thing. I need to go to Modify Panel. I need to enable shadows. We'll do V-Ray Shadow Map because it's fast. But the important thing is shadow parameters here. Enable atmosphere shadows. If you don't do that, then your shadows won't work. And it's the #1 thing a lot of people are complaining, like, oh, my shadows aren't working, my renders look flat. Why is that? And it's because you didn't enable that. So no matter what you do in here with, as I'm about to add in my light, I go to the rendering and I can enable cast receive shadows here. Doesn't matter what you're turning on, it won't work unless you have that enabled. So the other thing I wanted to mention is just if you enable use GPU, it's a lot faster to draw on screen. Only problem is with 3ds Max, I don't know why this is, but Fume, when you're doing GPU, if you're doing fire and smoke, it doesn't really order them the correct way. It just looks a bit different to how it renders out. Maya Fume Effects does it brilliantly. It's just Max, I've just found, doesn't do a greater job. When you're doing it with just smoke or fire, it's fine. It's just that. So if you go View, Shadows, enable that. we now have this, and it's cool. But I understand if you were to add fire in here, it just wouldn't display as accurately in the viewport. So I tend to just switch GPU off, which, as you can see, is a lot slower, especially with shadows. All right, so let's just render out a frame of this so we can see it in context. And just keep in mind that we're rendering regular geometry, not TP, so the shaders aren't set up and the mapping, so it's going to look different, but I'm not concerned about that. I'm just wanting to look at how the atmospherics are playing out. All right, so this is pretty dense already, and so although we have one light, I might actually add in a second one already, because the lighting in the shot, I think it's like 4 or 5 p.m. The sun's kind of going down, but it's still, you still have it's getting close to magic hour, so I kind of imagine we'd have a bit of backup light around. I'm just going to do the same thing that we did before, just adding in extra light. And the main thing is to set my multiplier to 0.3, so that way by the way, I just need to add my lights, of course, but that way it's just going to have some additional light, so it doesn't have as much shadow. Most of this, like, I script everything these days, just speeds up time so much. Like, I don't ever set my Fume Effects output paths. I never add lights in myself. Like, everything automatically gets added. And yeah, just workflow wise, it can just, even just spending 5 minutes just to write tools specific to your shot changes everything. And by the way, technically the GI, it won't affect Fume. It will affect the environment that Fume's in, but it won't affect Fume. So right now, because I'm just focused on the atmospherics, we don't have to have GI, like global illumination, on. It's just going to slow things down, as you can see. It's useful when you want to have like interactive lighting from the fire, things like that. That's where it can be really useful. But in a situation like this, at least right now, technically I should not have a GI on when I'm testing out the atmospherics. So I might just cancel out of this. Before we do any more rendering, let's just dive in and I'll talk about optimizing Fume a bit. So in the illumination here, this is a sampling for generating an illumination map. We can bring the threshold right up, and that way it really doesn't go as in-depth with generating that stuff, and I honestly feel like that is fine there. All this we can keep the same. I think for dust, something like this, we could probably set this to 100, and this means it's gonna, the steps in the remarching are gonna be a lot less, so it's just gonna render a bit quicker. That's pretty much it. Like, there's nothing too crazy here. I definitely want to tweak the shader, but let's just get our first render of this out. And just for any reason, if it is taking a long time to render, just get rid of those two spheres, wherever the hell I put them. Yeah, these guys. So, anyway, they were there. I don't really need them anymore. I might just kill them. But yeah, I just want to point that out because they're highly reflective and that kind of affects things too. Alright, so for the time being, that's fine. I'm going to switch back to TP just because I'd like to see the actual destruction geometry, so I'm just turning that on. Alright, and so this is the destruction now building, which is pretty cool. And so render with Fume. Okay, and we're getting something like that. It's about a minute, a bit over a minute to render out. Alright, so what I'm going to do, I just want to balance this out. Like I said, I don't really want this to be too thick. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to set this up to be green. I turned my background off. I'll explain in a moment why. But I keep my background off when I'm not rendering just because I don't know why it actually, even though you're not displaying anything, it actually slows down your viewport. It took me forever to figure out like what the heck was going on, but it's the background in your environment. So I usually have that off a lot of the time. So I'm going to try 1.5 for this. You got visual fall off, which essentially is going to just kind of like allow more light fringing on the sides. Can be kind of handy. And then you can accentuate the darkness of the shadows here. There's also sharpening, stuff like that, which sometimes I mess with, but it's extremely slow, which it makes sense why, because it's doing it to the actual voxels. We can do color range, so we can actually get some color in here. You know, whatever we want to do, that will just spread out the range of color. Alright, yeah, I mean, for the most part, this is a no-brainer. I mean, these are pretty much the settings I'm intending to work with. I need to do the other container, the exact same settings as well. So just keep that in mind, but I'm going to drop the background back in again. So something along the term of this. Now, there's also, while we're at it, we can also do render in the V-Ray render elements atmospherics. That can be pretty handy, just so that way we can single out the atmospherics. You can also do a material override if we want as well. So we could turn the material override on and then drag the gray plastic shader in there. And that can be handy just to kind of turn all the materials to a solid gray, so that way it's a little less deceiving at times, just in terms of seeing everything consistently. So this can be effective this way as well. So that's just a way if you had, like, if you actually had complex shaders or ones with a lot of sampling, you can kind of quickly just switch it over when you're balancing out the atmospherics. Now, in terms of the dust here, it's pretty intense. It's a lot more intense than I was planning on, just in terms of opaqueness. So just keep that in mind that I might bring it down. But let's bring in the other dust here. And what I might do is get the dust I've been working on and just go save preset. That's going to save as temp. Temp is actually one they use for a script to roll out shaders across everything. So you hit a button and it quickly copies it across. But in this case, it's just handy because I just want the rendering and illumination. Oh, that's actually one thing I totally forgot, is I mentioned to output the extra detail. So why don't we do that just for fun? I'm going to just make like a noise texture. Make it fractal, give it lots of octaves. I don't want to spend much time on this, I'm just going to drop something in. But let's go to rendering, enable fluid mapping. Oops, not for the fire, for the smoke. Fluid mapping, I haven't used this in probably 10 years. But let's just compare the two. I'm going to turn TP off for now, just so I can render quicker. Okay, so we don't see it too much here. I'm going to do two things. I'm going to make it bigger and crank the black and whiteness of it. I just want to physically see the pattern initially, and then from there we can revise the shader a little bit. Sorry, I totally just remembered as I was hitting a render, of course, fluid mapping, I should be using explicit mapping, not object XYZ. Otherwise, it's not going to actually respect the coordinates. So, yeah, I think I'm going to set this about 2, and I'm going to set the high value pretty intense. I want to get a lot of contrast in there. Yeah, okay, I'll give this a shot. But all it's going to do is just going to add that extra bit of detail to it. It's not the same as wavelet or anything where it physically changes anything. It's just controlling the densities a little bit more. Okay, so here we can see that kind of just helps add a little bit more for free. I mean, pretty much for free. So while I did that render, I just turned my other grid. So let me just turn that back on. But same deal, rendering, fluid mapping, and then dropout map in. Cool. Finally, let's just bring up that render again. So, all in all, I don't mind this. I do still think it's way too dense for what I'm really going for. So I'm just going to finally, I'm going to half the density, I think. So let's just do 0.75. Let's just try that, or 0.5. Okay, I'm going to do 0.5. I think that will work. Now, with the lighting, I guess, like, let's quickly toy with that. So we're not doing HDR. So what I might do is, let's see, I'm gonna introduce a little bit of blue lighting. Okay, I'm just gonna try that. Okay, so this looks good. I'm digging it. I want to start introducing the fire and pyro now in here as well. So let's go effects, destruction, explode. I might want to go back a few frames to something a little bit more intense. It's like 198, 195 around there. Let's try 185. All right, so that'll be a good starting point. Okay, so I'm going to add in the lighting. Same deal, undersampling 3. I'm actually set my step size lower to 20. I just want to try and get as much sampling in there as I can. Turn on cast receive shadows. I really don't care too much about playing with this stuff. I might push the shadows a bit if I want this to be more dense, but I don't know. Let's just have a render of this. I might toy with multi-scattering, which essentially is just going to fake doing like GI for this, which will help kind of get the fire to illuminate it, things like that. I'm going to keep smoke off. I'm going to keep fire at 0.5. I'm going to set fall off at 9 and turn... Actually, I might keep these on. So let's just see how this looks. I'll bump it up to 1. I'm just going to render out a frame. I just want to see how this looks. I'm just curious, really. That's why I'm bumping up the fire strength, whether I can get this to share the illumination in here. I'm just kind of curious to see how that will work out. The density of this is quite opaque. So if I were to make this green, she doesn't really show it as being too opaque, but it is set at a opacity of 4, so just be aware of that. But yeah, let's just take a look at this and see how it looks in conjunction with these other grids. Okay, so this took a while to render. It might have been just because it's the first time I've rendered this grid, but it does look cool. I don't really see too much interaction between the two, so I'm just going to turn those off because of that. And I'll bring the fall off down, which makes it spread out more. I'll bring that back down to 0.5, or roughly around there. But yeah, I mean, I like it. I think it's cool. I might try and increase the opacity. I'm going to do another frame. I just want to see what we get now. Okay, so at least render time's down to 5 minutes. It looks relatively the same. So I could crank the fire, but I like, again, the subtlety of it. I think this is looking cool. I'm actually really excited to render this out and take a look. Now, so I feel like atmospherics are cool. Actually, going back in, one thing I did mention before is bring up my frame buffer. was rendering out the V-Ray atmosphere, and that means I can just focus on the atmosphere layer by itself. Okay, and that can be handy at times just to kind of see what it's doing. But yeah, I like all this. I think it's all looking neat. I don't have too much to do. Like, you know, this lesson is kind of short. I mean, there's definitely more I want to get into in the whole integration and CG, like lighting, everything. But I just want to kind of go over the basics. Unfortunately, this isn't something I've gotten to like dive really deep into, just given the timing. But maybe I can do some follow-ups. So turning on GI, we could also just do a radiance map and light cache. It's a little bit faster, but I think these days you could definitely brute force this stuff. I also, when I was rendering my atmospherics, I put it down to 1, just because it's a lot quicker. We can turn motion blur back on. Oh yeah, let me just check if there's the material override anymore. Turn that off. So at this point, like, we've got the basics all going. Right now, like, I wanted to set all this up because I want to start rolling it out for all the other buildings. So it doesn't mean that we're finished by any means with the lighting, but I didn't want to go any further until we had like really set in stone how we're going to render all this out, and all the lighting, the look of it all, so that way we can start to replicate and do all the other buildings now without needing to go back and tweak all of the buildings to adjust them. Now they're all set up, so that way we can just kind of quickly set them up for every single building and then roll it out. Actually, sorry, let's go back to RGB. Yeah, so then we can roll it out for everything else. So there's definitely things like this that I turn off reflections for a second. So a couple of minor adjustments I'm going to quickly do is just with the shader here. We don't want the ground to actually be rendered. Okay, so let's just go into collisions, ground. I'm just going to say renderable off, ramp off, and that way they don't render out. Otherwise, we're going to have duplicates of them, and we'll just set them up as matte objects, basically. So, with the shader, we'll be able to tweak these, forever. It's not that big a deal, but I'm just going to go in and bring the brightness down even more on these. As well as the reflectivity here. I'm just going to really lower that down. Okay. And the final thing I'll just mention is, like I said earlier, anytime you're thinking the shaders aren't updating, it's best just to scrap them and reapply it. Should maybe just be able to refresh it, but usually drag it on there just in case. Anyway, so plenty more to do here, but like I said, I just want to get all of our mapping and everything set up so that way we can kind of progress forward with this. And then we can revisit this later to actually really dial it in more. But basically, like I said, this lesson was more about kind of tying up loose ends, getting the fire shader, all that stuff set up correctly. And lots more to do here. We still have actually the beam, and I'm just going to quickly jump onto that. But there's definitely little things we can tweak about this. But I'm liking where it's all heading. So finally, the one last thing I just want to get into is going to be doing the laser beam effect. So again, this is something that we'll tweak later on, but ultimately we're going to do like an interactive lighting pass for this. So there'll be like a blue splash and everything. That's something that we can do. This is also extremely low res, but I kind of always intended it to be, because I knew that this would be a pretty heavy comp thing. So if we look at the resolution I'm simming at, it's like 180, 180, 250 for length. So it's really just 180 by 180. So it's quite low res, but I know that we're going to get a lot from it. So I'm pretty happy with it. And we can definitely do like more of a tighter shader if that's something that we wanted. You know, I kind of like it as it is, but there's definitely a lot of options there, depending on what we want to do. So anyway, like I said, I'm keeping it as is for now, but that's the sort of idea of like what I've got in mind for this. And you know, I think that this effect does the job quite well. We just have this fluctuating effect coming down. And don't forget, we also have that beam blast, which we're not using right now. And again, it's because there'll be separate comp elements in the end. So that's an old cache. I simulated on one of my render nodes, and I guess I need to update TP on it, so it's just not coming out correct. But anyway, so let me turn TP on. But yeah, basically we have these like cylindrical shapes, and that's something that would be a separate render element. We can add glow and do a lot with as well. So there's plenty going on. Yeah, so like I said, these elements by themselves look pretty shady. Like I was saying when we were creating them, they were kind of more aimed at like game effects quality by themselves, but that's where we get into comp and we go crazy and do some really awesome stuff with it. So yeah, lots still to do, but now we're at a stage where the next phase of this, in the next lesson, we're going to start to replicate this. We're going to start building all of the buildings, because there's lots of building structures all the way along here. So we've built the entire effect, and we're going to take it a step further. We're going to build it to be more procedural, but then we're going to roll it out for every single one of these buildings. And then finally, the same lesson, we're going to start to render everything out, which we then will be bringing to comp. So we're getting there. We're on the home stretch, but we still have lots to do. Okay, so how'd you go in this lesson? We've covered a lot, and we've got 2 more lessons left, but I'm going to try and sneak in some bonuses and other things like that where I can. Like I said, I'd love to do a Facebook live stream sometime, or to see where I can give value wherever I can in the additional bit of time that we've got, because I really want to focus on trying to level up our skills as much as we can during this free training. So like I said, tag me in your work as you continue to update your work in progress and keep moving through the training. I'll definitely try to give some encouraging words where I can, and keep at it, soak up as much as you can. Look at everything that we've accomplished so far in just 6 lessons. This is a huge accomplishment. So next video, we're going to be covering all the final bits of 3D. We'll be rendering out all of our elements and bringing this all together, and then finally doing our compositing. So this is going to be a lot of fun. Okay, so keep an eye out on your inbox for the next lesson, and I'll talk to you soon.